Welcome to the New Wealth Way podcast, hosted by Dr. Joaquin Wallace. We're diving deep into the intricate layers of the 7-stage generational wealth model to offer invaluable insights on legacy building, wealth accumulation and preservation, and financial growth across generations. I'm Dr. Joaquin Wallace, and this is the New Wealth Way podcast. Hey, future wealth builders, this is Dr. Joaquin Wallace, and thank you for joining me on this latest episode of the New Wealth Way podcast. Today, we're stopping on stage 2 of the generational wealth model. And to help me do that today, I have Rahkim Sabree. Kim, yes, we know Rakim. Eric being Rakim, we have him on with me this afternoon. Now, before we get into introducing Rakim, let's kind of talk about the New Wealth Way podcast and the purpose of it. Now, you know, this podcast is based on my 7-stage generational wealth model, and we'll talk about that in a few moments. But if this is your first time tapping in, make sure that you subscribe, because the more subscriptions we have, the more people can hear our message. Now, we are on YouTube as well as your favorite podcast platform. So what we're going to talk about today is the model itself. Again, it's 7 stages. Stages 1 and 2, we talk about the past. That is stage 1, which is your internal and external ecosystem. Stage 2 is your financial genetic code, which we talk about financial trauma and financial anxiety. The present is all about stage 3, financial healing and reprogramming your financial genetic code, which moves into stage 4, which is financial edification, which focuses on financial literacy and financial inclusion. Now, we're talking about the future. That's stage 5, which is your financial well-being. And stage 6 is generational knowledge, because we know generational wealth begins with generational knowledge, but we have to create our financial footprints. To help me with that, again, we have Rahkim Sabree. And let me give you a little background on Mr. Sabree. He's an award-winning thought leader on financial trauma. He's a financial therapist, and he's an accredited financial counselor as well. And he's also written a book called Financial Irresponsible. Now, Rakim, thank you for coming on the show this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
So, Rakim, before we get into the heavy lifting, I always ask my guest one specific question. Tell us one fun fact about yourself that no one would probably know about you.
Yeah, I like this one. So I practice Wing Chun Kung Fu. I actually started the practice through a period of time where I was experiencing very high anxiety. And so Wing Chun, the principles behind Wing Chun are, one, using the least amount of energy as possible. So kind of the idea that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, but also mindfulness is a part of the practice. So not preempting or being very tense in your movements, but being able to react very quickly. There's a concept within Wing Chun that refers to contact reflexes. And so basically, if I could touch you, then I can know that you're getting ready to make a move, or what direction you're getting ready to make a move from. So I didn't start the practice because I wanted to beat people up. It was actually very instrumental in helping me navigate and control some of the dysregulation that I was experiencing around anxiety.
Well, you know what? You have a very calming presence right now. So I'm calm right now listening to you. So obviously you fit exactly what you're practicing right now. You had a chance to review the model. What was your initial thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very comprehensive and consistent with where the industry is moving in terms of, acknowledging the role of financial wellness and this holistic approach to healing. I really like that the model focuses on the future as well. So I think a lot of conversations stop at, okay, this is what happened to you in the past. These are the steps that we can take to help navigate where you are in the present, but doesn't really spend a lot of time on focusing within the generational wealth accumulation and internally distribution. And so I think that you focusing on that in this model is very important, because we hear the term generational wealth tossed around quite a lot, but I don't think that there are too many examples that speak to how to actually execute on that.
I appreciate that. So I have a 3-part question for you. And I always believe this question kind of lays the foundation of the model itself and kind of gets us into this podcast and in our discussion. So before you became an advocate, before you got to this space where you're at right now today, where were you at?
Definitely in the past. So a lot of the drive that I experienced in first starting with financial literacy and moving into financial therapy came from some of my own experiences growing up. My parents were young parents. They were teenagers when I was born. And when they separated, probably around the time I was 15, I became very central to administering kind of the household finances, and an assistance to my mom. And so I became aware of the fact that we had Section 8, we had food stamps. I helped budget those food stamps. I helped shop with those food stamps. My mom taught me how to, price out the name brand versus the store brand. And I didn't realize at the time that a lot of those behaviors and observations would lead into what I now have vocabulary to describe as money scripts that focused on more avoidant behaviors. When I started to work in the banking industry at about 21 years old, I started to learn about financial products, financial services. Of course, I had to communicate these things to the customers. In the process, through osmosis or on the job training, I started to try to apply those things to myself and realizing that most of my peers did not have the same knowledge that I was getting on the job. I started to talk about it a lot more. And so it's been kind of a gradual shift in my journey, if you will, from experiencing kind of like the trauma of my experience, not recognizing that vocabulary to call it trauma, moving into understanding how should I start to position myself for financial success in whichever way I define that, because I think that looks different for everybody. And then sharing that information with other people as I transition into this healing stage where that's kind of where I'm nestled now and focusing on helping people identify and move beyond the financial traumas that they've experienced.
You kind of talked about it, but what was your aha moment?
Going to work at the bank, I think, was the aha moment for me. I think for a lot of reasons, and I'm sure we'll get into those as this conversation unfolds. But I talk a lot about financial trauma as it shows up within Black Americans, specifically as a subset of a larger generational trauma. Well, ironically, in the environment that I worked, the banking environment, very conservative from a kind of corporate perspective in terms of how you show up, how you communicate, what the expectations are, and engaging with clients. I also worked in what was referred to as a mass affluent market. So most of my clients were people who had money, who had an education around money, who had financial products that they were aware of. Some of them may have had money managers or they were private clients. And so they expected an even higher level of service and financial acumen in communicating with them. And then my peers, my managers, they didn't look like me, right? They were, for the most part, in the early stages, middle age or millennial white women. And so their experience financially was different than my experience financially. What they had access to was different. What they talked about was different. The openness in which they talked about some of these things was very different, was very foreign to me. And so my initial thoughts going into that environment was like, why are you telling everybody your business? Because that's how I grew up. Money, we didn't talk about money with other people. That was rude to talk about money with other people. And so once I started to realize what I didn't have based off of what they articulated that they did have, I was like, oh, I'm behind the eight ball. Like, I need to get my stuff together and figure this out. Start paying attention to credit, start paying attention to being intentional about saving and investing and the benefits package that came with my employment. And we kind of turned it into a game. Like, we would compare credit scores, we would compare credit limits, we would compare the number of credit cards that we had. We would talk about the percentage that we put away in our 401k. We would talk about our salaries and we would strategize together as we kind of climb the ranks. What should you ask for as a percentage increase? What kind of roles should you be looking for? So there was a lot of socialized financial education kind of being passed back and forth that I think they had the privilege of learning through their experiences and their networks that had I not been in that environment, I don't think I would have had the awakening, certainly not as early as I did. And that awakening rather led to some pretty monumental accomplishments for me. I think probably the crowning accomplishment for me was purchasing a home before I turned 30.
When you mentioned, we're going to go back just in terms of your internal and external ecosystem, how that was so important and kind of moving you to where you're at today. I call it walls in. Oftentimes, we don't get the opportunity to have those conversations, as you mentioned earlier. I know you're out there, you're changing the game, if you will, you're being a voice in this space. Where do many of your clients fall within the model?
Wow, that's a good question. I mean, I this could be manufactured results just based off of where my area of focus is, but I tend to stay around kind of stage 2, stage 3. So that's where the trauma and the anxiety is existing, and then of course where the healing is implemented. So in financial therapy, I will work with people to kind of acknowledge that this might be an issue, right? And I think a lot of times when people hear money and they associate financial help with being bad with money or not making a lot of money. And the truth is that, the income doesn't matter, right? The behavior matters, the belief matters. And so you can have high income earners who are on the same spiral as low income earners, and they just feel a little bit more comfortable because they make more money, right? So they have access to more in terms of resources. But the healing process and the acknowledgement of some of the financial stressors or some of the financial trauma that they've experienced or that they might be experiencing in the moment is a universal experience that I've observed.
That's interesting because when I talk about the model itself, the model isn't a race-based model. I mean, I've always said that once you begin adulthood, you are constantly navigating one of those stages. And I like how you mentioned while you was working in the banking industry itself, you was basically looking at your future in terms of financial edification, in terms of literacy and inclusion. And in one area, I know we're not talking about that today, but I just kind of want to dive into that just a bit. When you was talking about participating in your 401k and qualified plans, if you will. My theory is, as a financial advisor, that many of the clients that I meet are very hesitant in doing so because they always go back to their stage one and stage two in terms of them not receiving all of their money because they just don't know exactly how long they're going to be there. And their financial stress is a little bit different than others, if you will. I mean, I love how you touched upon that because that's an area, we talked about the model itself, the past, the present, and the future. Well, that present is so important because I can't plan for my future if I'm not able to take care of first the past, deal with that. I love how you kind of dived into the trauma and the healing. We have to reprogram the financial genetic code, which is difficult in itself. My question to you is, what are some of the pushback that you receive when you talk to your clients about both stage two and stage three of the model?
Most frequent pushback is kind of the one that I mentioned, right? That there's a resistance to adopt or embracing an attitude of healing because, well, there's nothing wrong, right? I make enough money. I think there's a lot of anxiety and shame associated with not having money. And if that was a part of your lived experience, there is, and this is true of myself, there is this innate desire to distance yourself from that reality as fast and as far as you can. So when you think about looking for help and what that might look like, there is a reluctance to admit that you need help in a lot of instances, or you can allow some of your previous experiences to inform that process. So for a long time, I didn't realize that there were different kinds of financial professionals. I thought all of the financial professionals were trying to sell me a product and that they were always going to make out and I was always going to get the short end of the stick. And that's because the first encounter that I had with a financial professional, that was the reality. That was the case. I was not treated with the same level of enthusiasm or appreciation or respect that I witnessed that individual treat clients who they recognized they were going to get a payday off of because I didn't have any assets to invest. And so when I had that experience and it soured my outlook on what financial professionals looked like, not only did I not want to work with a financial professional, but I did not want to become a licensed financial professional because I didn't want to perpetuate that same trauma onto somebody else. Now, all these years in the future, being a financial professional of a different kind, I'm grateful for that experience because where I think there's a place certainly for licensed financial professionals to address a lot of the tactical approaches to wealth building. I do, I've fallen into this group of us, this subset of us who can acknowledge some of the foundational issues that exist, maybe around budgeting, saving, debt elimination, building credit, etc., but also can acknowledge a lot of the behavioral and psychological barriers to what financial success and wealth building can look like. And because it's such a new area of the financial industry, there's a lot of pioneering that's done by those of us who kind of exist in this space. So I think, everything happens for a reason, but certainly the resistance can come from a bad experience with somebody who's, only objective is to sell you a product. Some other objections that I've seen or just kind of experienced in working with people are around, like we talked about these money scripts, avoidance or vigilance, right? I think those are two really opposite ends of the spectrum where people are like, money is the root of all evil, right? Or, in order for you to acquire so much money, you have to have done something terrible. Or I don't deserve this money. So let me get rid of it as much as I can or as fast as I can. Or I have money and I'm experiencing survivor's remorse. I need to help my family and my friends who, always have an issue, always need to borrow money. And so I never take the proper precautions in establishing financial boundaries or simply telling them no, right? I have to save myself first. And so when we have conversations, I know you mentioned that this model is not a race based model, but I do think that it's important to acknowledge the role of racism in capitalism and the way that it's practiced in the United States, certainly, and around the world, and how when certain demographics, particularly Black Americans, hear that word capitalism, how they react to that, sometimes very violently in an emotional sense, because of a recognition of abuse that has taken place from the financial institutions on down in robbing Black Americans of wealth and creating barriers to building wealth and not providing adequate education or access to resources. Some people simply give up. And non participation in financial systems is a thing. It's kind of a theme that I've been running with lately, where I work with organizations that include credit unions and other financial institutions who have this belief that in underbanked or unbanked communities that most of the time are comprised of Black Americans or Latinos, that their lack of financial literacy is what contributes to being unbanked. And my pushback to that thought is there is a willful non participation in these financial systems due to some of the financial traumas that these institutions have created through systemic and institutional abuses against these demographics. And so, certainly, it's justified to say, well, I'm not going to put my money in the bank, or I'm not going to put my money into an investment or a 401k or an IRA because I don't know that it's going to be there tomorrow. So we see so many instances, particularly in the Black community, around, death occurring and there's no life insurance policy in place. So they go to the GoFundMe's or to the fish fries and we're trying to raise money because there is a disconnect around not whether or not life insurance exists or whether or not life insurance is a necessary part of the estate planning process, but because there are Black people who are alive today who have witnessed relatives put money into life insurance policies and not get the payout because of some issue. And so, to your point two, on stage two, rather, on this model, there's a lot of conditioning there that is justified. It's not just an internal issue of, I don't know, or I had a bad experience, or a series of bad experiences. It's observations, it's historical context that says, well, I don't trust this because my mom didn't trust this, because my grandmother didn't trust this. And this is the reason why.
So, Rakim, that's a great answer. You mentioned the fact in terms of the external events that happen. I love how you kind of merged in the money scripts as well, because that's so important. You wrote a book called Financially Irresponsible. What was the book's focus and what did you want your readers to take away?
Yeah, so it's funny you asked this question now because as I was writing the book, the title was designed to kind of catch your attention, right? Like I worked with a book coach, shout out to Joe Doris, and he asked me in the process, he's like, "What do you want this book to do for you?" I'm like, I want to be on TV." He's like, "All right, well, we have to have a really captivating title and we have to have a really captivating cover." And so I use, bright colors. I actually use very intentional red, black, and green colors to kind of speak to the experience, the Black experience, in a very subtle way. But also that title, Financially Irresponsible, the thought behind it was that it would be financially irresponsible, or it is financially irresponsible for you as a consumer to defer all of the financial decisions that you make to somebody else, right? And that you should take an active interest in learning and understanding the products and the services and the professionals that you work with and be more involved in that process, especially if you're not in a position to defer those decisions to somebody else. The other side of it was, some of the concepts that I discuss in that book are considered financially irresponsible, but they were strategies and concepts that worked for me in that moment. So this is 2019 when the book came out. The book turned 5 this year. And I look back at it And I'm like, man, there's so much that I didn't know, but there's also a lot that I didn't know. And so I do have intentions at some point of re-releasing it with updated commentary on a lot of the concepts that I discussed there. But really, it's a journey through the lens of my experience with money. And it speaks to the first chapter is titled, like literally what we're talking about. First chapter is titled, Money is Not the Root of All Evil. And so I intentionally divided that book into two parts. I wanted the first part to address your spiritual and mental relationship with money. And then I wanted the second part to address this practical, tactile approach to money. And I quote a book quite often in my book called Post Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy, where she talks about generational trauma and how that shows up in the Black American experience. At the time, I didn't have the vocabulary to describe epigenetics or financial trauma or how all of these things kind of interplay in the way that I do now. But it was a foundation for me landing where I've landed. I have thoughts certainly of going back, like I said, and revising some of those concepts, but I also have thoughts of going back and kind of emboldening some of those concepts because now I have the vocabulary to describe it.
You know, it's interesting because the purpose of this podcast, again, was to bring people on, experts like yourself. I wanted to be more transparent. You know, in social media, people are out there, financial influencers, if you will. And it's a lot of information that's out there, but it's half truth. And the goal of the podcast was to bring people on and to make sure that each person that comes on is geared to speak about a specific piece of the model, which you've done so eloquently. But I love how you tapped into life insurance. I mean, that's stage 4, and stage 6 of the model. And I liked how you kind of delved into the spiritual aspect. And that's why I felt that stage 4 in terms of financial edification, because edification does mean that spiritually and morally uplifting, learning, knowledge, if you will. My argument is, and it sounds like we're on the same page, is that I firmly believe that financial literacy is important, but it's a small piece to the puzzle and it's not the end all. And you hear a lot of individuals talking about the importance of financial literacy. But as you and I, we realize that our aha moment was, yes, that's important, but it's not the end all. I ordered your book. It should be here any moment as well. So I'm going to definitely do a read on that because I love what you're doing. I love what you're trying to accomplish. When we talk about wealth and scarcity, how does this scarcity belief influence a person's mental state and potentially lead to two distinctive paths? One could be a saver and the other one, a hustler, or falling by the wayside of learned helplessness. So that's another question. We'll get to learned helplessness right after this one. But how does that scarcity mindset affect us today?
Yeah, great question. I don't actually think I've ever been asked that question. When we think about the neurology, right, our brain and how our brain reacts in moments of what would classically be considered fight or flight. Now they've added freeze and fawn. There's a different part of our brain that's being activated, right, in those moments where we're experiencing really survival mode. And the part of your brain that's responsible for rational thought starts to kind of depress. And the part of your brain that is responsible for that fight or flight response starts to activate. And so when we think about that in terms of like a physical threat, a bear, a tiger, a car on top of a human being, right? You really don't need so much rational thought. You just need to get out of that situation. The problem from a psychological perspective is that our brain cannot recognize the difference between this perceived threat and this actual physical threat. And so a lot of people live their lives or large portions of their lives in this state of survival with a depressed prefrontal cortex and a very highly activated amygdala. And so, the question's often asked, right, in these financial circles, well, why would somebody make a decision that they know is to their detriment financially, even if they're in a situation where they're maybe not making a lot of money, or maybe they are making a lot of money? And that's the answer, right? It's a survival reaction. We're not thinking rationally. We're thinking about how do we get to tomorrow or the next day or the end of this week. And we normalize this very unnatural process through our experience, which again, I think is burdened by capitalism in a way that is practiced in the United States, which I believe is a very intentional practice from a systemic perspective. And people never get the opportunity to really, if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, experience self-actualization because they're stuck in trying to address, like you mentioned in your model, the innate needs, or move from a place of their traumas, or move from a place of anxiety or fear. And it kind of creates this spiral, or really this cycle of kind of staying in the same place. Even if you're, flailing, your arms, your legs, everything, you're asking for help, you're looking for help. And so this idea of scarcity is not, it's not a natural idea, right? Scarcity certainly is manufactured in many instances. We turn on our TVs or look at our phones and we see advertisements that say, buy now, or you won't see these prices again. These are our lowest prices ever, only until the end of the week. We practice scarcity in the brand of consumerism every year. Black Friday, Christmas, Halloween, Valentine's Day, all of these really commercialized holidays. Like, we have to do this thing at this time and spend this money very specifically. And what happens if we miss it, right? Oh, you don't love me. You don't care about me. You have all of these external pressures that exist that kind of keep you in this state of reaction. And so, even going back to an earlier point that I made, even if you're a high income earner, in a lot of those instances, those pressures are still the same. And so the reactions are still going to be the same. Make more money than anybody else around you and still have a very scarcity driven mindset that speaks to, back to the Clance's model of avoidance, speaks to avoidance. Or on the other end of that spectrum, like I said, you can have extreme vigilance and saying, well, I need to make sure that I have enough. I need to make sure that I always have on hand. I need to make sure that I always have access to. You tie that in with some of these other variables of anxiety, of racism, of the institutional blocks that Black Americans and other Americans experience, people who are experiencing poverty or middle class. It keeps the system going. And so there is a dissonance I've noticed that exists within people who've attained some level of financial success that says, well, I have to play this game in order to stay on top, or in order to get as close to the top as I possibly can, even though my heart's not in it. Or people who say, I'm not participating in this system, whatever the consequences are. I'm just going to, and this kind of leads into what you mentioned about this learned helplessness. The system is designed against me. The man is trying to keep me down. So I'm just going to stay down. I'm going to take advantage of whatever resources and opportunities are available. And then we see how that like spirals out into politics and into these really strong stances that people have around a reliance on the system or abusing the system, or, let's look at student loan debt as an example, right? So many people, particularly in my age demographic, who were told, go to school, take out the loans, get a job, pay the loans back. Everybody takes out loans. It's okay. And now we're experiencing a crisis where millennials can't afford to live, but can't afford to buy homes, can't afford to invest, can't dig themselves out of the debt that they have accumulated. And the rate of inflation, the cost of living, the salaries, it's not allowing room to breathe. People are really experiencing, beyond financial crisis, more mental health crisis. It says, like, how do I get out of this? Student loan is really the only kind of debt that you can't get out of with bankruptcy or any of these other traditional means of debt elimination. And it really touches all areas of our experience. And when I say it, I'm talking about money, our relationship with money, and some of the choices that we've been funneled into making, maybe unwillingly or unknowingly, or knowingly, but not feeling like we have an alternative choice.
I loved how you went into stage 3 in regards to the amygdala, right, in the hippocampus, because that is so important. We had one of our guests prior in episode 5, we touched upon that in terms of neuroplasticity and things of that nature, how that comes into play. And then, I loved how you kind of delved into stage 1, which is Maslow's 5 hierarchy of needs. I mean, that's so important. People don't realize the top is self-actualization, the bottom is your physiological needs, safety, social, self-esteem, in particular, externally. Externally, when we look at that, walls in is what we've learned. That's culture. That is what has been given down to us. I often say that our first financial fiduciaries were our parents, grandma, neighbor, cousin, friend. Those were our first financial fiduciaries. And it's a perpetual cycle because they're learning it from somewhere else. As you mentioned earlier, we're already behind the 8 ball going into this thing called life. right? Thomas Kuhn talks about shifting your paradigm, paradigm shifting, the scientific theory, if you will. And so when you look at where we're at today, it's a slow drip, right? Although there's a lot of information that's out there, I may agree with it. Some of it I do, some of it I don't. At least there is some conversation happening, right? Before, because remember, this is a conversation that's never been talked about, right? In our homes, we just don't talk about it. We talk about everything else, but money is one thing that we don't talk about. And people like yourself in this space is trying to bring the knowledge, if you will. You touched upon learned helplessness, which is huge. In my first book I wrote, it was Welfare to Work. And when I talked about the clients, if you will, coming from a government system, the learned helplessness, self sabotage that often happens along the way, not wanting to be successful and understanding that it's not going to work out. And we've all been through that. People within the marginalized communities have always been through a situation of learned helplessness. And that's why I started the questions off, what was your aha moment? Because you transitioned from that learned helplessness to where you're at today. I did it as well. In order to be successful in this type of work, one, you have to have some shared experience, right? It's very transparent. And you have to take on a servant leadership because you talked about trust, right? People coming into the communities, not trusting the information, so to speak. So you have to have a servant leadership and some shared interest where the people can say, hey, you look like me, you talk like me, and you understand what I'm going through. So that's extremely important. So how does the historical context of economic disparities in the African American community contribute to present day financial trauma and anxiety?
Great question. I think, first and foremost, that point that I made about willful non-participation in financial systems, right? And just to kind of clarify, those historical events, if you will, are also present day events, right? They have persisted through time. It's not something that, stopped at a particular year, right? We see instances and there's the jury's still out on it, but present day, right, with Navy Federal in the news around their percentage of approvals for first time home buyers that are white versus first time home buyers that are black, given similar not credit scores but credit profiles with regards to income and debt. And certainly the variable of credit score makes a difference in determining whether or not lending practices are, or rather whether or not lending is issued on something like a home. The disparities are large. And Navy Federal is not the only one. We've seen Wells Fargo in recent years. We've seen Bank of America in recent years. This thing that seems like, oh my God, who would do that? And speaking from the perspective of somebody who worked in the banking industry, every year there are compliance training shoved down our throats around, fair lending and the Fair Credit Reporting Act and all of these different things. We're like, well, all of these regulations are in place. Like this can't happen. But it can happen, especially if a system is built in that way. Certainly, there are loopholes. There are ways to misrepresent information. There are ways to present information in a certain way to make it favorable to other people or to specific people. And so I think, all of those things contribute. When you talk about internal versus external, they play on each other. I'll go back into, talking about the spiritual component of my book, the concept of as above, so below, right? What we see in the heavens, we see in the earth. I think that exists on a physical level in our bodies. What's happening inside of our bodies happening outside of our bodies. I think that exists on a psychological level. I think that exists on a political level. So there are connections that exist between these outside influences and these internal influences that validate each other when we talk about things like trust, when we talk about things like resistance to not upward mobility in terms of an economic sense, because I think everybody wants to have more money. I think everybody wants to be good with money. I think everybody wants what comes with money. But what those barriers look like, some people may decide that obstacles that they have to navigate in order to overcome those barriers are not obstacles that they want to navigate. And then there's some people who's like, look, I'm gonna do whatever I gotta do to make this work. And how do you strike a balance between those two things? When you talk about values, when you talk about morals, when you talk about the money scripts, certainly we've seen instances in the recent past where people are doing things that may be considered dishonest to game the system. And even when we're looking at the lens of dishonesty, fraud, and other forms of white collar crime, who's going to get in trouble the fastest, right? Who's going to be able to avoid that trouble the fastest? What kind of resources do you need to avoid that trouble? It's not an even playing field for everybody. And I think that, I mean, it's a lie. If I'm going to just be straight about it, the lie that is told about it being equal opportunity, even playing field, everybody's treated the same, is something that some people just kind of embrace and adopt because it's easier to just kind of close your eyes and put your head in the sand. And some people on the other side of that become very radicalized and say, well, this game wasn't built for me. So I'm going to play it however I feel like playing it. And as a financial professional and as a fiduciary, like certainly I can't endorse that behavior. But from a psychological perspective, certainly I can understand why that would even be viewed as an option, especially for somebody who or somebodies who have for their entire life or a large portion of their life had to figure out a way how to survive.
Yeah, it goes back to that scarcity mentality. Considering the emphasis on instant gratification today, what impact do you believe social media has had on shaping unrealistic expectations about wealth generation in the African American community?
Yeah, I love this question. It's a double-edged sword. It really is, because I've certainly benefited from social media in the establishment of and reinforcing of a personal brand in this world of finance, right? I just started posting one day, not with the intentions of becoming a public facing figure or anybody of influence, a thought leader, just to kind of share the knowledge that I've had. And then it turned into what it turned into, and I've been able to amplify the work that I've done. I've been able to amplify my experience, my expertise, the credentials that I've acquired into larger opportunities that maybe don't necessarily exist only on social media, through books, through writing for publications like Forbes, through podcasts and other forms of interviews like this one. But on the other side of that, if I didn't have positive intentions, certainly I won't call anybody out, but I've seen instances where people will give, like you said, half truths about how certain financial products work in order to get more people to buy into those products, or taking advantage of the traumas that people experience, using the phrase generational wealth as a means to market their product or their service that is not working to the benefit of the consumer, right? Because a lot of the people who jump on social media and promote financial products, concepts, services, etc., are not fiduciaries, right? So they're not obligated in any way to make content that is geared towards the best interest of those consumers. They're making content that's motivated by how they can line their pockets. And it's a challenge in kind of this clash between qualified financial professionals and experience-based financial professionals, because I've been on both sides of the spectrum, where it's like, well, if you don't have a credential that governs how you show up, then how can we hold you accountable? We just kind of have to take your word for it. And I think that there are brilliant people who are not credentialed, who can talk about some of these concepts just as intelligently or more intelligently than people who do carry industry recognized licenses and credentials. And on the other side of that, there are people who carry industry credentials and, these titles and still are crappy people, right? Like the biggest example that I've seen, or rather the biggest offenders that I've seen, particularly targeting the Black community, are insurance salespeople. I've seen people talk about index universal life insurance policy as the end all be all to generational wealth building. I've seen it compared to the work of the Rockefellers and Walt Disney. But if you're selling a product that an individual can't afford, can't maintain over the long term, and on the commission end, you're getting the higher payout, you're scamming the people, right? Like you might think that you're providing a service, but you're scamming the people. You're not giving them all of the details, all of the information. And so I think like that makes people who are burned in that process experience financial trauma. Like in the moment, I trusted this individual. I tried it. It didn't work out because they didn't give me all the details. Now I'm going to tell all my friends about it. And then it damages the work that you're doing, right? In promoting generational wealth building through the proper structuring of some of these products and services at the proper stage and time in somebody's financial development when they actually can afford it and when they actually do need it. And then even outside of that, right? Not even just people who are Black perpetrating this against Black people, but we see content creators like the Robert Kiyosaki's of the world and the Dave Ramsey's of the world creating their content with a very large Black audience and making statements that are kind of disparaging to that population. So, we're good enough to give you our checks, to buy into your programs, to buy your books, but, you're making statements about how we're animals and wild and losers or idiots or, just this really shame and fear based marketing styles to gain the allegiance of white saviors when it comes to money. So, going back to a previous question you asked me, why did I write Financially Irresponsible? I didn't see too many published books that had a Black face on it talking about money. Now I see so many, and I'm super excited about it. Black and Latino friends that I have, personal friends that I've had, that I have acquired over the years, over the last 2 years specifically, releasing books talking about their experience culturally in money, talking about their experience in financial trauma or financial therapy, talking about their experience in college, navigating, student loan debt. You asked the question about the financial influencer. What I'm seeing as a shift occur is that a lot of these financial influencers who look like me are going and getting the credentials so that they can back up what it is that they're saying and so that they can kind of push back at the people who just paint them with a very broad stroke and say, oh, you're a financial influencer, but you're not a financial professional. So we shouldn't really be taking you seriously. And I'm excited about that. I love that.
That's a great point because I can go on for hours in regards to insurance, IULs, VULs, whole life. I mean, all of those are outstanding products, and we know that. But if you use and structured properly, we know that. But there are half truths. One of the focuses that I have as a financial planner, I have a bachelor's in economics, master's in marketing, doctorate in public policy, Series 6, 63, 65. I'm licensed in insurance, property and casualty, all of those things. But what I've often found is that you have to consistently remind individuals of that as well. As you mentioned earlier, a lot of people just don't have those credentials. And one of the reasons, again, the podcast we created was to bring on people like yourself and give them a platform to communicate about something that they're passionate about. Could you explore the potential strategies and solutions for addressing and healing financial trauma with the African American community?
So I have a model that I've referred to in the past. It's called the 3 E's: exposure, education, execution. And I created this model before I got into the world of financial therapy. So as you ask that question, and I think about how my response may have shifted since then, I think that there is a component of mentorship that has to kind of fit into the equation somewhere. And that model is true to my experience, right? You become aware of a thing, right? This is me going into the banking industry and hearing my peers talk about the 401ks and the 850 credit scores and owning homes. And then you learn about that thing. How do you acquire that thing? Through education. And then you execute on what it is that you've learned. But I find that that doesn't acknowledge what are some of those psychological barriers to really getting out of the way of yourself. I've described in the past the execution phase as being the most difficult because you could very easily talk yourself out of making the progress that you work so hard to kind of visualize for yourself. And one of the truths that I've realized in my experience is that mentorship has played a role, right? I've had people in my corner reinforce the abundance mindset and point out where I have limiting beliefs or demonstrate through their own behaviors where this is possible. You just have to do it. I find that within the Black community, that mentorship piece is missing and it's difficult to drive because so many of us are operating from a place, even in experiencing success, are operating from a place of competition rather than collaboration, are operating from a place of kind of scarcity, but a different kind of scarcity than we've discussed. Scarcity in that, don't rock the boat, or you have to work twice as hard to get just as far, or you have to talk this way or dress that way, or put your head down. Like there is a kind of like a falling in line that I notice as we climb socially that says this is how you're supposed to show up. And people who haven't arrived to that point, who feel as though they are being true to themselves in that moment, are very resistant to, why do I have to be somebody that I'm not? Why do I have to embrace a behavior that is different from the behaviors that I've already established for myself. And I don't think that that's necessarily completely right or completely wrong, any end of that spectrum. But I've been on both sides of that spectrum. And I've learned a lot through that about what it means to show up authentically as myself. What are some of the concessions that I've had to make working in a very conservative financial background and transitioning into entrepreneurship? And then just partnering with mentors, right? Who, like I said, have shown me that, okay, you have some limiting beliefs here. Even though you talk about this all day, let's turn that inward and see, how are you getting in your own way? So yeah, I think kind of putting that all together, I think the 3 E's definitely: exposure, education, execution, and mentorship.
So if someone wanted to get in contact with you, book you on their podcast, what ways can they get in contact with you?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So my website, first and foremost, RahkimSabree.com. That will feed into all of the socials, and all of my socials are my name, at Rahkim Sabree. To read any of my Forbes articles, you can go to Forbes website, type in Rahkim Sabree, or Forbes.com/sites/Rahkim Sabree. And I have a newsletter that I send out on Substack called Overcoming Financial Trauma, and that is rahkimsabree.substack.com.
Sounds good. Future Wealth Builders, make sure you tap in Rahkim Sabree. I mean, he's all over the place doing great work in his financial space. We just have to just say thank you again for Rahkim Sabree to come on. Remember the 3 E's: exposure, education, and execute. Who those three? On behalf of the New Wealth Way podcast, my producer, Ray Haycraft, I'd like to thank you for coming on and spending some time with us this afternoon. I mean, this has been such a compelling conversation, and we touched on things, and I'm sure that people who's going to actually listen to this podcast, they're going to come away with something, because this has been outstanding. So again, Future Wealth Builders, thank you for joining us this afternoon, Mr. Rahkim Sabree. And as we always say, generational wealth begins with generational knowledge. I'll see you on the next New Wealth Way podcast.
Thank you for joining us on the New Wealth Way podcast, hosted by Dr. Joaquin Wallace. Our show is edited and produced by Ray Haycraft. To dive deeper into the world of financial wisdom and learn how to create your financial footprints, head to our website at www.drjwallace.com. For more updates and exclusive content, connect with us on social media by searching Dr. Joaquin Wallace. And if you have questions and comments, feel free to email us at thenewwealthwaypodcast@gmail.com. Remember, generational wealth begins with generational knowledge. And as always, thanks for listening. The content presented in this podcast is strictly for educational purposes and should not be taken as investment advice. The views and opinions expressed by our guests may not necessarily reflect those of the New Wealth Way podcast and its host or producers. Listeners are urged to exercise discretion and judgment before making any financial or investment decisions. Always consult with a financial professional or advisor before taking any action based on the content of this podcast. If you're enjoying the New Wealth Way podcast, we appreciate if you leave us a review. We're always open to topic suggestions and guest recommendations. Feel free to reach out to us directly with your thoughts and feedback. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on the New Wealth Way podcast.